Okay.
Welcome everybody. We're just going to wait for a few more people to arrive. We are recording this session. So if you don't want your face on the recording, turn off your video. And if you could all mute yourself until we open up the discussion, that would be awesome.
It's very cool seeing lots of familiar names popping up on the screen. I'm enjoying that part.
Yeah, we've had lots of RSVP, so I think we'll give it just one more minute and then we'll just start, and I'll just keep letting people in as they arrive. Hi, Say. Okay, cool. I think we've only got an hour, so we may as well crack into it. And Izzy, maybe you can just let people in while I'm just doing this first bit. So I'm going to open with a karakia. We have been working with a crew called Reo Māori Mai for a while as a team, and they've given us a couple of really nice karakia. But when I was looking at the one that I'm going to say, I thought it's actually super appropriate. It talks about acting from good thinking. And I think today we're going to hear from Sue Coutts, who is just an epic good thinker. And also kind of collectively, it talks about how we will then be able to go and grow good things for the benefit of everyone. So that's definitely kind of a good fit for the kaupapa of today's conversation. So I will just start. No mai tēnei rā me ona hua katoa. He whakaro pai ka whakato. He hua pai ka tipu mai. He painga mō te katoa. Humie huie tai kie. So we're going to first start with Sue. She's going to do a very quick presentation, but definitely the point of today is to have a discussion. So I'm going to share my screen, and Sue, you just want to tell me when to flick over?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, present. So is everybody seeing that?
I am.
Okay.
Yeah, so I guess that's a good start. Yeah.
So this
All right, over to you, Sue.
Climate change one.
Okay, hang on a sec. I'm just going to exit out and just getting you all out of my way. Okay, so kia ora e te whānau. I'm Sue and I'm on the Zero Waste Network team. I am, at the moment, I'm working on our response to 2 government consultations that are out. So there's the waste strategy and the legislation and the emissions reduction plan. And our approach has been, our approach for this is to work with people across the network to share knowledge and perspective so we can get a really strong zero waste network submission together. So it's great to have so many people on the call, and we're really interested in hearing what you have to say. We're working alongside Parakore, who have a Māori perspective lens, and they're calling out to iwi, hapu and whānau, as well as Māori enterprise, to feed in and support their submission. And we're going to echo one another's key points. Hannah Blumhardt is here today, and she's supporting on the legislation and regulation side, so she'll speak a bit about that. And Liam Prince is supporting on the organics and bioeconomy parts of the emissions reduction plan, so he's going to speak a bit about that. And obviously they're feeding in a lot of information as well about other things. Our goal is to have a working draft of our submissions ready by the end of next week. And then we're going to use that to generate some submission guides. So they'll be around for 12th of November to share with anybody who finds them useful. And then we'll just keep on refining our submissions as we go towards the deadlines at the end of November. Okay, so do you want to click on to the next one? Yep, so today we're going to spend about 15 minutes doing a quick outline of what's happening. We're going to share our thoughts of what's in the documents, and we're really keen to leave space to hear from you guys later on. One of the things that's really important to emphasize is that the focus for our submission is really about the members. We're writing it from a zero waste network perspective, and so the focus of our members is really around leadership for zero waste, and in practical terms that looks like a lot of activity at the local scale, particularly around behaviour change, and then practical projects and services around composting, reuse, repair, recycling projects, that sort of thing. So we're obviously going to be focusing our submission through that lens. Yep, next one. So to achieve our zero waste goals, we're really interested in that whole production and consumption side. We really want to make the jump into that regenerative circular economy that we've been talking about. And all of us share a common story about how we see that happening. We want to, jump to the next one. And so for those people that have been part of the development of our kind of theory of change work, the piece of the puzzle that we're really focusing on with the submissions is that political system structures and leadership lever. Obviously that flows right out across the system. The changes that happen there will affect all of us, and they'll create the rules and the expectations that guide behavior across the whole system. So we want it to be good. Next one. So there's the government at the moment is seeking feedback on two different documents. The first one is they're proposing a new waste strategy, and they're also putting up issues and options for changes to the waste legislation and regulation, and that's due in about 26th of November. And at the same time, there's consultation on the emissions reduction plan, which is a discussion document that's based on the government's response to the Climate Change Commission's advice, which came out earlier in the year. Both of these are quite open documents, and they're looking for us to feed in as much as we can. So they're calling out for ideas in the emissions reduction plan document about how we can meet our emissions budgets, and they're looking for gaps and opportunities in their thinking. So it's a really great chance to shine a light on the work that we're doing. Okay, so that's it for me on the slides, daughter. And yeah, so the thing that I'm going to do is just a general idea of what we thought from looking at this. I'm going to focus on the strategy piece first, look at our general ideas about what we noticed in the document, what we thought when we first looked at it was like the framing is very old-fashioned. It really talks about more of the same. The language is all about waste and waste management. And the big idea in the document is that we'll do better recycling and we'll drop less litter. And what we want to see is a switch to a focus at the top of the hierarchy. So we're investing energy and resources in the zero waste world that we want to build rather than maintaining the status quo. There's a strong theme of individual responsibility rather than how we can change the system we live and work in. There's very little about business, product stewardship, or territorial authorities. And Māori communities, small to medium enterprises and NGOs are really not written into the document as active players. We would much rather see responsibility reframed as leadership and contribution, so that sort of pulling from the front approach. And we want to be really clear about that the way that we produce and consume is creating a lot of problems, and that we can change that. And that activity sort of focus isn't in the document at the moment. In relation to the operating environment, there's a really weak story in the strategy about the pressures to transition. So climate change, no talk about adaptation, a little bit about mitigation. In terms of planetary limits is pretty weak. There's nothing much in there about social limits or inequality, a little bit about pollution, nothing about biodiversity. And it really doesn't explain the concept of strong sustainability, like that idea of putting the economy in the service of people and the planet. So we would like to see, real commitment to the wellbeing approach with capacity building to create local scale resilience. And we want to see the big levers that government's going to use to pull to do that much more transparent in the final version. There's a massive gap around Te Tiriti, Te Ao Māori and Mātauranga Māori. That's around the decision-making side as well as the opportunity side for whānau, hapu and iwi, as well as Māori enterprise. And there's been a lot of zero waste and circular economy specific work on the Māori perspective in relation to those two things that has been left out of the strategy. We'd love to see that come back in. And we really want to see the strategy and legislation align with the best work that's being done in this space across government, like the emissions reduction plan and the recent infrastructure strategy, both way better job. So good to see that more consistent. The story of how everyone's going to work together to transition is actually missing. The framework's really disjointed, so there's not really a logic of how the strategy is going to drive action across the board. It's very government focused. And there's no mechanism for coordinating all the players to implement circular economy and zero waste strategies. We want to see an independent circular economy and zero waste agency to focus energy and action in this area, to coordinate all the players around shared goals and to gather and share research and best practice. And that's sort of in the lines of Zero Waste Scotland or RAP. Having that intermediate role in between government and all the other players that are working in that space has been really useful in those countries. So that's the general sort of theme or tenor of the document, but more specifically around the strategy, then in terms of circular economy, the words are there, but there's not really a discussion about what the circular economy really is. It's mostly seen as recycling. Needs to build on the zero waste story and the waste hierarchy rather than replace it. There's a bit of a risk there. And there's no mention of consumption emissions. It's just really focused on methane from landfill. What we want to see is a really clear outline of how circular economy will be applied in Aotearoa to deliver zero waste and zero carbon and wellbeing and resilience goals. So for us, that's really about strong local economies, connected communities, and protecting and restoring our places and ecosystems. And that detail just isn't there. Like I said in the bit earlier, that the idea of local scale action or perceiving the work that we do as innovation is really missing. There doesn't seem to be any understanding that innovation already exists and that it's happening, and that community enterprises, social enterprises, Māori enterprise, there's so much energy and activity in that space which is just not being recognised. And behaviour change, as it's described in the strategy, is very top down. So it's all about what's coming down from the top. Government's going to tell us how to message, and it might involve us in it, but not really allow us to lead. And we would love to see a much stronger approach to investing in local scale behaviour change. And also, we'd love to see a much stronger commitment there to invest in that nationwide resource recovery network, which includes the whole local scale zero waste hub story. Outcomes and or what they're calling co-benefits in the emissions reduction plan, and social procurement is missing as well. There's not really much mention of how we're going to use procurement or spending to create outcomes, and we'd love to see that social procurement and public and private buying power story come into the strategy. I want to see all the public and council contracts outcomes driven in line with the government's procurement guidelines. So that's like Auckland Council's been doing with the CRCs and Southern Initiative work. And the way the principles are written now, there's a mix of outcomes and tools and strategies, and we really think that needs to be separated out and a much clearer story told about how that's going to fit. So how the values base fits with the technical tools like zero waste and circular economy strategies. And then there's just a big gap around economics. There's, it's a very primitive understanding of the economic opportunities around reuse, recycling. There's a lot of, there's very little detail on how we're going to fund and finance all that work. The only real revenue stream they talk about is the WMF. And there's something interesting about our way of thinking about waste reduction is really what economists call demand management. When you don't want to have to spend a lot of money creating infrastructure, it's great if you can reduce the demand for those services. So there's a good opportunity for us to really speak to a different way of thinking about reuse, recycling, and the behavior change work that we do in terms of investing and growing those systems, about how we resource and fund all those different projects. That's about it from me. So I'm going to pass off to Hannah now, who's going to talk a bit about the legislation side.
Kia ora. Thank you, Sue. Kia ora, everyone. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the legislation. I'm going to talk for 5 minutes, and I'm going to focus on 5 big things that have stood out to me. And you'll see that a lot of it is really interconnected with the stuff that Sue has said already. So in terms of the legislation section, which is part 3 of the consultation document, there's a lot of stuff in there that is quite good. So more work definitely needs to be done to understand what regulatory tools are needed to drive circular activity at the top of the waste hierarchy. So waste prevention, reduction and reuse strategies. But even so, you've got ideas like right to repair in there, stronger regulatory powers that we've wanted to see for some time, like the ability to mandate source separation for food waste and recyclables, mandating recycled content and things like packaging, the ability to set quality and performance standards for things like curbside recycling. There's a suggestion that the levy could be expanded to cover waste to energy, but also downcycling too, which is pretty cool. They've proposed a right to return packaging, thrown around ideas that maybe we could make brands responsible for their littered products, and they want to make the deposit return scheme provisions stronger as well. So that's all good. They're also really wanting to increase responsibility for actors, people, organizations who manage and handle waste through duty of care frameworks and licensing of operators. And most jurisdictions have already been doing this for some time. So these suggestions are really overdue and welcome. So overall, I think the direction of travel for the regulations is looking positive. But the issue is that the legislation section of this consultation document, it kind of moves from talking about one individual provision or regulatory power to another, like a bit of a shopping list, with no real story about how they all link together. So it's quite busy and piecemeal. So you might be like, oh, great, right to repair, that's good. But then when you step back from the details and you consider how weak the strategy really is, it's hard to tell how all these provisions are going to come together to play their part in a bigger story, or even, to be honest, if they will actually be used at all, right? Because as we know, the Waste Minimisation Act, it already does have way more powers in it than have ever been used. So just because we put great things into a piece of legislation, where's the story about how and when government is actually going to use them? The other thing I've noticed is that the theme of this whole document is about responsibility for waste in order to get our economy to be more circular. Well, the critical tool for that is product stewardship. But the legislation section really isn't proposing changes that would strengthen the product stewardship provisions so that they have a better chance of increasing responsibility for all that waste that's being generated up supply chains. So, you know, regulations that would mean businesses actually redesign their products and their business models. So the focus in the consultation paper is again on increasing compliance within schemes once they've been created. And there's a bit more oversight around government setting expectations and outcomes for schemes. But there's still no proper process being outlined for how we decide what products are going to be part of a scheme. And we'll really basically no process for kind of outlining how we're going to reduce the randomness in the system at the moment. So how are we going to decide what products are going to be part of a scheme? Who's going to make those decisions? How are those decisions going to have to be made so that it's not just once a decade when the minister feels like it, they'll declare some priority products. There's still nothing about the design process itself, and that's a really big problem, because at the moment the design process is basically like, hey business, here's some money for you to go away and come back and tell us how we should regulate you so that you're less crap. So if we don't fix all of this randomness in the system, then we're really not going to be able to tackle all the behind the scenes lobbying and delay tactics and watering down of schemes that we've been seeing for such a long time. There is also no opportunity to discuss the values and principles that underlie the legislation. So the consultation paper does mention very quickly that they need to look at the purposes and principles for the Act, but they basically say nothing about what they could be. They don't have any questions in there about the waste hierarchy, or how the hierarchy should be set out, or how each tier of the hierarchy will be defined. And all this stuff is really critical for how the law will be applied. And we have no visibility or opportunity to share our thoughts on that. There isn't even any discussion of how the vision and principles from the waste strategy might actually be built into the legislation itself, which is pretty bizarre. And the final thing is just that there's very little about how government is going to improve the legislation to strengthen its ability to partner and support and empower anyone other than themselves. So there's absolutely nothing about using the opportunity to reset the legislation to uphold a te tiriti-based partnership with tangata whenua based on power sharing. There's nothing about embedding principles of social procurement into the legislation, nothing about how the waste levy fund allocation process could be overhauled to distribute greater funds to community groups, or even grow top of the waste hierarchy activity that already exists in small and medium businesses in New Zealand. So in summary, some good regulatory bits and pieces proposed, no overarching story of how it fits together though, not enough focus on strengthening product stewardship to be the superpower tool that we need it to be to stop waste generation in the first place, no visibility or opportunity to discuss the values or principles that will guide how this legislation is implemented, and no proposed amendments that would make power sharing or collaborating with tangata whenua, communities, small businesses and existing innovators expected and easier for local and central government. Oh, sorry, I'll pass over to Liam to talk about organics. Sorry, Liam.
Nice one. Didn't know where it was going to go there, but yeah, kia ora koutou. And thanks Hannah and Sue for really good summaries of those parts. We've kind of been, taking our areas of interest and focusing on those things. So I'm really looking at the organic waste stuff, and all the proposals across both consultations are really all about reducing emissions from organic waste. It's a priority area, one of the 6 priority areas in the strategy, and there are a few tools in the proposed legislation around organic waste, but really it's the emissions reduction plan where the most detail is. There's the waste sector emissions chapter itself, which is again all about reducing methane emissions from landfill. But there's also this idea of the bioeconomy, which is supposed to be part of the circular economy. And if you're not familiar with the idea of the bioeconomy, it's primarily about replacing anything we use fossil fuels for. So for energy, fuel, products like plastics, synthetic fertilizer, whatever, replacing them with organic materials or renewable biomass, as it's called in their lingo. So even though really it's a pretty narrow focus just to look at emissions from organic waste, the proposals in the ERP do have some good stuff in them. So they're basically recommending a pathway to get as much organic waste out of landfill as possible by requiring things like separating organics for collections or at resource recovery centres. And they're also proposing to ban most organic waste disposal to landfill by 2030. So that's really awesome. However, they are emphasising nothing's set in stone and they need to collect more data before they decide whether it's needed and stuff like that. And from my perspective, that doesn't make sense because, you know, one of the key points of setting a disposal ban, say ahead of time in 2030, is it sends a strong signal that, you know, we need to get a move on and start building in the infrastructure to collect and compost that organic waste instead. So we definitely want to, you know, see them push ahead with those proposals, as well as setting strong targets around, other than just reducing emissions from waste. So, you know, diversion and separate collection rates, for example, would be good targets to set as well. But what's really missing in the organic waste proposals, 2 things really. A, there's not much detail on reducing organic waste at source, especially for reducing food waste throughout the food system supply chain. And B, there really isn't any detail about what we're going to do with the organic waste once it's been diverted from landfill. And that's such a big missed opportunity to support change in other sectors, especially the agriculture sector, to support the phase out of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, replace it with compost, which can help increase soil carbon and biodiversity. Now, you'd think that the bioeconomy as part of the circular economy could provide a good framework for what we do with organic waste, but there really isn't much of a connection in the ERP at all around between those two things. The bioeconomy really just seems to be how we make bioenergy and biofuel. And again, that's such a big missing link, because if we're taking organics and natural resources for our human economy, what are we doing to give back to regenerate natural ecosystems and restore the modi of soil, or how do we prevent the scary amounts of soil that we're losing in Aotearoa through erosion from industrial farming and forestry, which is really where the feedstocks for the bioeconomy will come from. So essentially, these proposals they're not really taking a full life cycle approach to how organic materials and natural resources flow through our economy. They're not taking into account the consumption-based emissions that occur throughout the supply chain that Sue has mentioned in particular. The proposals aren't thinking about how we give back to the taiao and regenerate the natural world that we're taking the resources from. And I think there's a big question to be asked around the implications for Te Tiriti o Waitangi with something like the bioeconomy. For example, does it uphold Article 2 that guarantees tino rangatiratanga of tangata whenua over their lands and natural resources? And finally, just going back to something that both Sue and Hannah have mentioned, there's nothing really around who's going to do any of this stuff. What's the role of community and mana whenua around organic waste in the bioeconomy? How do we localize these systems to build food sovereignty, to create meaningful work, to build community resilience, and all those sorts of things. So those are kind of the high level points that I've noticed with that, but yeah, really interested in your thoughts on it too. So I'll hand it back to Sue.
Okay, that's awesome. Thanks so much, you guys. And what we're going to do now is really interested to hear from everybody else. So I'm going to pass back to Daughter, who's going to be crowd control and general person who enables you to speak your mind.
Great. So any comments or questions? Obviously 3 really substantial things to get your heads around. It's probably a lot of information, but yeah, any off the top of your head comments or things that especially you need us to, that you don't think have been addressed, and you would like to tease out while we've got everybody here. Victoria, do you want to, Victoria, Blake, would you like to unmute yourself and talk a little bit about your comment there?
Kia ora koutou, can you hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. Hi everyone. Hi, it's really nice to see some familiar faces on the Zoom. So I'm the Sustainability Manager at the Bay of Plenty District Health Board, and I'm probably going to be the one that writes our submission as a health sector to the waste documents. We're probably not going to comment on the emissions reduction plan at the moment. I'm just really interested because I'm basically going to steal all of your work as to whether you've had a look at a public health lens. So we are looking at soil health and other things, but a more generic public health lens. Have you picked up anything like that through the document?
There's definitely been some discussion within some groups about the lack of a public health lens, and also the need, if we're going to be talking about the circular economy, to be talking about a safe, non-toxic circular economy. So that's definitely a gap that has been identified, and really good to raise that to make sure that it's included in the Zero Waste Network submission.
Yeah, there's I think something that's been talked about a bit over the last few months as well is mental health. And one of the things that we know about the way our economy is going is that having more and more and more stuff isn't making us feel any better about ourselves. And it's not, that approach of local resilience, communities working together in their own area to create solutions it's a way of bringing well-being into your world. You know, and a lot of the connections between mental health, well-being, resilience, and local are very important to us. And that's kind of like a background theme in our work rather than a foreground, but sounds like for you, it's maybe a bit more foreground.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's really cool. If you guys are picking that up already, then I'll make sure that when I'm having a look at it in more detail, that I really pull those threads.
I think that's one of the biggest things that's missing in the background of the document is there's no people in it. You know, there's a lot of documents that are going to talk to other documents, but there's actually only the two people on the front cover picking up litter. And I think the idea of human beings as active players, that you know, the story of consumption and production really needs to change for people to feel better about themselves and their worlds. And there's a lot of evidence around about that. That is something that we're going to draw out in that first part of our document. So once we get our points together next week, you'll be able to pull on those and probably have a few good links and references for you.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
And maybe that could be a reciprocal thing. So we've got until the 26th, 24th of November. So if there was an opportunity, Victoria, for us to kind of bolster our response and you've got some good ideas on that, then it would be awesome to hear back from you.
Yeah, great. If I can see your notes on the 12th, and then I will look at it after that and get back to you guys. Cool. Thank you.
Amazing.
Can I just quickly jump in with my organic waste hat on quickly again? Just Victoria, I don't know if you've spoken to the people in the Wellington Public Health Unit, but they're doing some really interesting work around food systems and well-being around that, and you know how we can create circular food systems and food resilience and food security and all that sort of stuff. So I think it'd be worth speaking to them from that perspective too. Certainly really interesting perspective. Yeah.
Liam, there's a comment from Karen there. Links on the bioeconomy would be helpful if anyone has them. I'm not sure if that's directed to you, but I think, can you talk a bit, I mean, just generally our plan is to reference our submissions, right?
Yeah. We'll provide a bunch of references and stuff around that kind of thing. But I'm happy to, Karen, to send you a few bits and pieces that I've found kind of doing a bit of background research. Just let me know what sorts of things you're interested in. But there's been quite a lot written about the bioeconomy in the last 10 years or so, and you know, Europe has kind of gone down that track, you know, for quite a while, and so you know, we're doing this thing where we're looking to Europe, who are further down the track, but we should also be learning from their mistakes in that space too. So yeah. Thanks, Liam. I can Google it myself, but if you've got anything that you think is particularly well written about this, then it'd be great to share. Cool, will do.
I think one of the other things Liam and I were talking about last night is that, you know, the whole story of the bioeconomy, which to us, we would probably call it nature or, you know, ecosystems or, you know, the garden or something like that, is that kind of the separation of humans from the natural world, and that we're kind of losing touch with one another, but we're also losing touch with our experience of the planet and, you know, the actual what it means to live in an environment. And I think that's another really important thing for that sort of mental health and, you know, that public health sort of perspective as well.
Great. So, and Joe's question is, how does the National Plastics Action Plan link with these strategies? I think maybe Sue, you're muted.
I was thinking maybe Hannah could talk to this because she knows more about the plastics world than I do. Yeah.
Oh, Liam can probably talk to it as well as the upper man, but I think there's a really big story to think about in terms of how the strategy links to the legislation work, links to the emissions reduction plan, is already fragmented, uncoordinated, and doesn't give a full story about what the circular economy is, who's doing what. Everybody has a different vision. And then to look at the plastics action plan that came out a month before both documents, that also seems to be existing in a world of its own. It's not a plan, it's not a strategy, it's just a work program of what MFE is doing already. But it's framed up as a plan, and then to think about how in the waste, in this consultation paper, the waste strategy legislation one, they're saying that in addition to strategies, that perhaps we could have more regular action and investment plans. And my question around all of that is, well, how they're saying, do you think that's a good idea? So, well, it's hard to know, because it's hard to know what they will look like. Is it just going to be lots of versions of the National Plastics Action Plan for every material and product type? Because that's not probably going to be helpful. So it's this a long way of saying that the National Plastics Action Plan doesn't really fit in. And this idea that you can pick your favorite material stream and go off and do a random plan that doesn't fit in with anything and isn't a strategy or a plan is quite problematic. But the story of the National Plastics Action Plan is that it was recommended by the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor that MFE had to do it. So I think it's kind of like it's had a weird history that doesn't fit in. I don't know if Liam has anything to add.
I was just going to and maybe you can speak to it more, Hannah, but it seems to me a real missing link between the litter stuff and the strategy and legislation, and actually what is the biggest concern around litter is plastic pollution. But there's no real connection around, like the litter stuff seems to be very much about individual responsibility and duty of care around not littering and stuff like that, rather than actually taking a bigger picture kind of framework around how we prevent and minimize the use of plastics in the first place, which really should be the core of a National Plastics Action Plan. So yeah.
Yeah, I think the one thing that is really impressively consistent across the ERP, the waste strategy, the legislation, and the Plastics Action Plan is that nobody wants to say what the core problem is, who's creating all this waste and all these emissions. So like you'd be hard pressed to find the word industry or business in most of these documents in any tangible sense. So that is the consistency they've managed to maintain throughout all the documents.
Okay, we've just had
I just have one last thought about plastics. Is about the only part I know about plastics. Is if we look at in the document, there are these weird 3 things which were strategic issues, and they sort of just are sitting in there as if someone stuck them on a sticky note, but they don't really fit in either. And one of them is waste to energy incineration or waste to energy. And, we really need to think about this waste to energy thing. And I guess the connection between plastics and waste to energy is very troubling. We're not, unless we actually go upstream and start talking about what kind of plastics we're making and pushing down into the system. It's all very well to say, yep, we would love to be able to recycle everything, but a lot of the stuff we know that comes through the plastic stream you can't recycle. And so then it becomes a problem, and everyone goes, oh, perhaps we'll just burn it instead. And then you're going to create fossil fuel emissions by burning the plastic instead of burning the fuel in the first place. And it's an issue that they flag, but there's no discussion, there's no analysis, there's no consideration of that. And so I think that that's something which it's obviously one of the things got left off our list of 5, but yeah, it's another, that whole plastic and waste to energy story is a really big piece of the puzzle.
Okay, there's a comment from Betsy that I'll read out, but when we were prepping for this session, we had some email exchanges, and Sue's kind of key thing that she wanted to identify today, so this is really a question for everybody on the call, is we wanted to identify the critical aspects from your perspective. So Susie, you've just said, I'd like to see plastic pollution fleshed out because you've got conservation groups interested in submitting. That's great. So if everybody can have a think now about, you've heard some stuff about what we think is important. If you could, have a think about what you think are the critical issues and potentially just chuck them in the chat or raise your hand and you can talk to them. But to read Betsy's comment, she acknowledges it might be quite specific, but we're finding how waste collectors charge their customers is really critical. Currently, they charge by lift, not weight. So it's cheaper for supermarkets to put everything, including recyclables, organics, and rubbish into one skip rather than sorting it. and our organics collection and composting projects can't compete. If waste collectors had to charge by weight, then the rising waste levy would hit the commercial waste producers in the pocket. Where would this comment go in the document?
There's a lot of questions in the document that have not been asked. And so the whole story of economics, competition, how we're going to arrange the financial side of the collections process and all of that is just absent. And so I think there's a few different angles that we can work to talk about these kinds of things. One is the duty of care. Parts of the legislation talk about separation, so the obligation to separate different materials out. And so that's something which the Europeans have been doing for a while, and they're really pushing for source separation of different material streams, so that, and making it a requirement on businesses, households. So everyone has to separate organics from recyclables, from rubbish, from other materials, you know. And I think that that's something that we can emphasize in the legislation side, that obligation to sort of separate at source is very important. But I think that the story of how organics collections and processing are funded needs to be fleshed out as well. And that's a big missing link in the document.
There definitely is scope if you Betsy, if you wanted to have like a targeted point about it, to put that in your answer to, or our answer to the regulatory tools, because they do mention mandatory source separation and the potential to do that. And the other opportunity is to talk about how it could be fit into the duty of care framework as well. So that there's a duty of care to collect separately and to present your material streams separately. But that's a very narrow answer to the question, whereas Sue's given that bigger picture around the economics.
Okay, awesome. No one has their hand up. There's no further comments. Maybe it's useful to just go through the process that we're going to take in terms of what we're hoping to put out. So Val and others, please chip in if I get this wrong. The plan is to have the draft, and Sue's already mentioned this, have the draft submission, all of them, ready by the next Friday, the 5th. That will then, so in the past, we've written quite lengthy submissions, and that's still the plan this time, but we've also produced guides. So people can make quick submissions, and we're aiming to have those guides out around the middle of the next week, so around the 11th. And then the main submission will be a document that can be fed into, like Victoria, you could feed into that document, and will be a joint submission, so people can put their logos to that submission. But also I think there is, Sue's been kind of checking out what would be the most effective way to really get as much change as possible. And it's really come through that it would be really good for different parts, like particularly our associate members who are businesses, if they could put in their own submission, because they will be considered kind of in the business sector. So we would really, really encourage people to make individual submissions, as well as to sign on to the joint submission, and to kind of flesh out points that are really relevant to their activity and to their interests in those individual submissions. Does anyone have anything further to add on that process? No. So we've got lots of comments, yay. Susie, you had your hand up. Do you want to come on and talk to it? You put your hand down again.
Oh yeah, sorry. I was just going back to Betsy's comments, which is probably going to be covered by the economics of it, but like the economics of local composting solutions and community composting solutions, it's challenging because, you know, sending kilos to landfill is just too cheap. So I just hope that's really clearly laid out in the submission. Mommy! Hi, Theo.
Great. Alec, you also had your hand up, but I've put it down again. Did you want to say anything?
Yeah, look, I think for me, Sue's nailed it. And the question from the Bay of Plenty Health Board, it's the economy. You know, you don't really have to go any further than that. The whole economic system is set up to be wasteful, and waste is paid for, and recovery isn't. You know, I think that's the sort of soundbite cliche. But I think the other thing is that the economy is not healthy. It's not healthy for us. Everything's been privatized and commodified, so you can't access healthy produce it's not a competitive market. So I think the thing I'm interested in is turning the market language back on the marketeers to say to them that this mythical allocation of resources through a pricing mechanism isn't actually working, and it hasn't actually been working for probably about 40 years. And I think if you reset the language to turn around and say that not only are you transferring your responsibility, your physical, your fiscal, and your information responsibility to other parts of the system, it's not an enjoyable economy. You don't get any joy from it. You don't get any happiness from it. You don't get any real well-being from it. And any of that you get is contingent on your ability to be able to afford to participate in the first place. So that then confounds the notion that in order to keep the market going, you've got to sell more and more cheap crap stuff made from plastics or whatever else it is. Then you've got the narrative from those that do that, including, you know, Tyndall and his warehouse group and all the rest of it, that as long as I can market a story, the public will continue to buy it. But the reality is there is no competition for the public to make a choice. So to me, unless they get a recognition that the current economic activity is killing us and killing the environment and the social structures, they might not want to say that in a ministry document. I get that. There's a way to dilute it and moderate it, but you've got to signal up front that it's the economic system. The food waste from the supermarket is paid for. It doesn't matter whether you measure by volume or by weight, it's paid for by us. So their incentive to do something different has to come from a different nudge or a different legislative prompt, because it's not going to come from current. Some will break ranks and do the right thing, and some of the supermarkets have tried. But generally, waste is built into thinking, and it's paid for by the wider participants. So I think the strategist does nothing to unwind that concept. And I think unless you get that bit right, the rest of it is really just, it's kind of irrelevant. You've got to recognize what the source of the problem is, rather than trying to stay in the waste management space and trying to do clever things with this continual byproduct. This system just it'll just keep producing it forever. There's nothing in the strategy other than the first bullet point in a few paragraphs about reduction. It's too hard. There's nothing about the treaty. We know there was some history there. They don't know how to change from a Western paradigm that is killing them to an Indigenous paradigm that might actually save us. So I'll stop at that point. Yeah.
Liam, Hannah, Sue, do you want to comment, or shall I move on to say? Move on. Okay. Say, there's been good engagement with your comment, but I'm wondering, for the sake of the video, if you wouldn't mind coming on and just making your point.
Oh, thanks, Dora. Kia koutou katoa. Thanks for this opportunity. It's I guess having been part of seeing the development of the strategy, I was inspired by one narrative behind it, and that's the narrative that we don't see. And part of it is that it really connected. I could see, having been a Pacific voice around that table, it started to connect me to this. Otherwise, this is like a whole series of chapters under the book of the strategy that actually doesn't inspire. It doesn't connect. It wouldn't connect my community to want to get up and really make a difference in the world. We've got 3 amazing chapters of the emissions. It's the infrastructure, but we're so disconnected from it because putting food on the table and survival is probably more important, but we lost the opportunity on how we can really have engaged the diverse communities around, look, there's a strategy coming up. These are the things that we're looking to do. The COVID approach is probably similar to that. We've missed the opportunity with people around education. But I really feel that key to that was the narrative and the presence of Te Ao Māori and its representation of the principles of the Tiriti o Waitangi on that. They've taken that away, which has left this void that says, what is my connection to the strategy? And I think if we can correct that, it'll help us to bring some real substance to the things that we want to, that we desire from this. Because something as simple as understanding the whakapapa of the materials that we produce, and where that takes us back to, that provides part of the solution. And that's what I think what product stewardship approach starts to provide, is an understanding and recognition of that whakapapa. And so I would love to see, I hope that the ministry still has the opportunity to really bring back the Te Ao Māori into this strategy, because it'll start to make it a lot more inclusive, certainly for my people in my communities, because they want to do the right thing. Sue Wallace is on here from Waiuku Zero Waste. We've got a great guy called John here. Well-being for him is having those clean waters in his neighbourhood. I know for Rick it was having the eels come back to the creeks. And for all our different communities, there's well-being means something to us. And there was a great Tongan proverb that talked about what is well-being to a Tongan. And he said well-being for a Tongan is one's ability to fulfill their obligations to their God, their family, and their land. And for us, this is what seems to be lacking. One is the process for consultation to be more inclusive, but also it doesn't inspire. So what is the generations after us going to say when they see our work we've done? What did this generation do? And I think it's just lacked that punch and inspiration. Sorry, I rambled on a bit, but it's something like that.
Great, wonderful. And I think Therese's point kind of expands that out. Like you've expanded it temporally, and Therese's point is kind of like, where is the boundary and what are our responsibilities to our Pacific neighbours as well? We are coming close to the end of the call, so I'll just try and keep moving with maybe some comment about Polly. I'm wondering if you want to talk about social procurement and producer responsibility at all.
I'm feeling a bit on the back foot, daughter, because I haven't even managed to get into the documents yet, but I guess that's just the things that are coming to mind that will be really important for us in terms of the focus area for Sustainability Trust on resource recovery, and just thinking about how the potential to build jobs from circular economy, but wondering if the strategy is really thought about how we bring, how we start training people to be able to deliver those jobs. I think we're already seeing a massive increase in the need for people with our skills, but how are we responding to that through kind of training our young people?
Great.
Can I just quickly comment on that? Just Polly, I think probably the emissions reduction plan has more, I mean, Hannah and Sue may maybe speak to the strategy and legislation, but the emissions reduction plan seems to have a little bit more around, the transition and equitable transition, and that story can be part of that, brought out of that. They haven't really linked it to the role of the circular economy and helping that transition, which is again a missing link, but potentially trying to connect that good potential that's in the emissions reduction plan around the transition, and an equitable transition is one pathway.
I think that also, like linking into what Liam just said, there is so much work to be done to pull the waste strategy out from the bottom of the waste hierarchy through tools like product stewardship to look at, the full potential if we want to reduce waste generation, to get up supply chains. And at the moment, what it kind of looks like is MFE's decided that it's going to hang out at the bottom, and then the top of the waste hierarchy economy stuff like MB will do later. And that's certainly the vibe that comes through when you read the ERP and the strategy together. And so a lot of that stuff around the potential of a new economy in terms of health benefits, well-being benefits, jobs, that stuff is not coming through the waste strategy, because it's kind of almost like, oh, MB will look at that later. So that's something that we need to find a way of calling out, I think.
Okay. Sue, do you want to comment?
I'll leave that question there, but I see that Val's asking me to answer another question that was further back. So I'm not actually sure. I was just trying to scan through and see where the question was, but it's basically something about, going back to Say's point, there's a lot of us involved in the working groups associated with the development of the strategy over the last 12 months. And we fed in a lot of energy, a lot of ideas, a lot of kind of thoughts. And I think it would be fair to say that there was universal support for the work that was done by the Rōpū. It was very clear that that was something that people felt was a thing that brought everyone together around a shared approach or a shared kaupapa, and gave us energy. And even people like me have been involved for so long, sort of started to feel a bit excited about how we can all be in our waka and going and doing this journey, and we're going to pull up the new world. And I think that it's very, very frustrating, and I think that I've had a couple of very angry weeks. Just going, it goes back to that point about how we're going to go into a world where we have experts in government who don't understand the subject matter writing strategies or trying to coordinate the future. And that only works if you take notice of the people who are working on the ground and listen to what they're saying and hear the stories from the people who have been working in different places about what actually will make change in their communities and what will resonate, and what all of that knowledge and capability has to be able to be harvested if we're going to make progress. And that's really where we are talking about having maybe a different type of organization like RAP or Zero Waste Scotland, or somebody that can be a intermediary between all the different players and government, so that there's a place for us to meet and talk and be heard and to hear one another and to collectively agree on how we're going to move forward. But each of us has a partial perspective, and obviously we speak from our own point of view when we're around that table, but we're also listening really hard to understand the person next to us. How do they think? What are they doing? How can we join arms with them? How can we move forward together? And I think that that's something that, we'll be really trying to tell that story of how we can have better processes for harvesting knowledge and moving forward in uncertain times. So yeah, very frustrating to be part of the process and have it all just thrown out. Very frustrating to be barking dog outside the room, shouting, making loud noises and no one taking any notice. And now we're in this strategy process, this consultation process, and we have to let that all go and just put our best foot forward and say what we need to say.
Okay, great. Well, going to be a very well-timed session and end now. So just to reiterate some of the things that are coming up, there are a couple of opportunities to hear from the ministry, and I think for each of those sessions it's a Q&A, so good opportunity to turn up and ask some questions of MFE. So the first one is happening on this coming Monday, 12 till 2. It is going to be on the emissions reduction plan, or the waste and F-gas chapters of the EPR, and then on, and that's hosted by Wastemans, so that's awesome. Then on the 2nd, the Tuesday, from 12 to 1, it will be a public webinar on the waste chapter. And that will also be a question and answer. And then it looks like there's a couple of one at 12 to 1 and one at 1:15 till 2:15. So then just to reiterate, we will be putting our draft submission out with some guides on the 11th. And we've got a video of this session, so if anybody wants to watch it again, they can. Just get in touch with me. Okay, thank you. I'm going to close with karakia. This one's called unuhia. Unuhia, unuhia. Unuhia ki te urutapu nui, kia wātia, kia mama, te ngākau, te tinana, me te wairua i te tangata. Koia rā e rongo, whakiri ake ki runga, tūturu whakamaua, kia tina, haumie, huie, tae kie. Thanks everybody.